What does your music say about you? There are a couple ways to interpret this question, and I'd like to try to address both in this video. The first is, what does the music you listen to say about your personality? And the second is, what does the music you write indicate about your personality? Which obviously only applies to people who write music, but it's a question that people have asked for quite a while and a lot of people just assume answers to, and I'd like to get into the science of it because it's actually really interesting. But the answer to the second question kind of depends on the answer to the first, and I'll explain why later, so I'll just get right to the first question. So what does the music you listen to indicate about your personality? Overall, the answer is very little with any confidence, but there are things about the music you listen to that increases the probability of you having certain personality traits. For example, if you listen to music other than pop, you are slightly more likely to have high openness to experience. And openness to experience is a personality trait that generally predicts things like liberalism, curiosity, and to some degree intelligence. Most of the personality traits I'm going to talk about in this video are actually designed by really intense psychometric studies, so I'm going to send a link to those studies in case you want to learn a little more about that. People who listen to jazz are also on average more agreeable and extroverted. The tendency for extroverted and agreeable people to like jazz is actually not unique to jazz. Agreeable and extroverted people tend to listen to music more in general, so if people listen to anything a lot, then chances are they have those qualities. The amount of time you spend listening to classical music actually correlates with neuroticism, which is a personality trait that generally indicates emotional instability. So people who listen to classical music tend to actually have a wider range of emotions, especially negative ones. There are also some gender differences where people who listen to pop music are on average more likely to be female, and I think that's a good example of just how easy it is to generalize all of this information, because you probably know plenty of people who are male and listen to pop music, so that probably gives you a good indication of just how reliable this information is. When you look at huge amounts of people, it's easy to find these patterns, but when you try to generalize it to individuals, it doesn't usually go as well. I just really hope people don't watch this video and use it to support their stereotypes. Rock music, and in particular hard rock, is one of the only genres where people who are high in agreeableness don't actually tend to listen to it more, and people who listen to rock music or hard rock also tend to be lower in conscientiousness, which is the tendency to try to be organized. But obviously there's a ton of variety within all of these genres. You can find people who really like some artists of the genre but hate others. So psychologists have also looked at other traits within the music that are actually common between all of them that can also predict some things about your personality. For example, people who are depressed are much less likely to listen to high-energy music, so if it's expressing excitement, happiness, and anger, then depressed people are much less likely to listen to it. Generally, sad people are more likely to listen to sad music, which is all pretty intuitive, but people who listen to sad music also just tend to be introverted, open to experience, and highly empathetic. And one reason this might be is because extroverted and introverted people tend to like different kinds of relationships. Extroverted people tend to gravitate toward a large amount of interactions with generally a large amount of people, while introverted people tend to focus more of their effort into a smaller amount of relationships, which means that they end up getting a lot closer in their relationships. So in relationships where you're not fully close, people tend to express happiness a lot, whereas people expressing sadness is something that's generally frowned upon unless you know the person you're expressing this to very well. So when somebody expresses sadness, it might indicate to an introvert that this is the kind of relationship and this is the kind of human connection that they're looking for. So introverts may be drawn to sad music because that's the kind of connection that they want to have with a person. So that's more or less what's known about the first question, and the second question is actually kind of a follow-up question to this. So when trying to figure out what we can know about a composer based on their compositions, we have to kind of take this data and assume that composers are going to try to write music that they themselves like. So this obviously doesn't really apply to composers who have some sort of other motivation to compose a particular piece of music. So if you're listening to a film score and it's expressing something very sad, you can't really assume that the composer was actually sad while writing it. He was probably just trying to write sad music for the sake of practical concerns. There's a dangerous misconception that mental illness promotes good art, but the evidence for this is very shaky. One scholar has reviewed the research done on this topic and found that out of 29 studies, over half of them were inconclusive, and the ones that were in support of the hypothesis that mental illness and creativity have some sort of link had some serious methodological flaws. Another piece of evidence that shows that creativity and mental illness are not inherently linked is the fact that art therapies actually alleviate a lot of mental illness. There are a ton of different forms of art and music therapy, and a lot of them have actually been empirically shown to have really positive effects on anxiety and depression. So if you want to be as creative as people like Van Gogh, Hemingway, or Schumann, you shouldn't strive to be like them in their personal lives because they were not happy and it's not worth trying to be like it, and chances are trying to be that way would not help. One thing about musicians that does show up in their music is actually the language they speak and their accent. There's been a weirdly large amount of research done on this, and overall the variability of the duration of syllables corresponds to the rhythms that a composer writes. So for example, in French versus English speech, there tends to be very different rhythms used, and those rhythms actually show up in the instrumental music of French and English composers. There are rhythms that show up in Scottish speech more than any other language, and those rhythms tend to show up in Scottish music more than any other music. A composer named David Bruce has actually explored this topic really thoroughly, and I would definitely recommend his video. So definitely check out more information about this if you're interested. David Bruce's video is great, and I have lots of links to other resources in the description of the video. And if you like my videos, watch more, subscribe, share, and if you want to, even support me on Patreon. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope you got something out of it.